Okay guys, so welcome to the third lecture for visual scripting. So in this lecture I'm going to break it into smaller sections so you can kind of digest it. We're going to have some Unreal examples as we're going through as well. So hopefully this will be like a little bit easier for people to follow along at home. So the first thing we're going to do is just introduce the topics for today. So we're going to be running through inputs, and that's using like the engine input manager. Then we're going to be looking at setting up a little bit of player movement. So that'll be really useful in answering this week's weekly task. And then we'll move on to how to record videos and where to submit them onto Blackboard for your weekly kind of updates. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just inputs in Unreal. So at the minute your project that you have has some kind of default input set up on there. You'll notice like if you're using WASD, you can kind of move around. If you push the spacebar in, you'll notice like nothing happens. So that's the idea behind today is we're going to set up some inputs inside of Unreal. So what inputs are is they actually let you do like a custom binding, so you can bind things to multiple kind of inputs. So it can be keyboard and mouse, it can be controller. So it's basically how you interact with your project, and it's how you set that up. So the input manager in Unreal, and I call it the input manager, but it's actually called engine input. Once we get into the settings, I'll show you it. It allows you to add those custom bindings. They are specific to the project. So just because we have it set up in this game that we're working on at the minute, or these kind of tasks that we're working on, doesn't mean that they'll be in the next one. So quite often, if you are planning on copying over blueprints or scripts, you need to make sure that your inputs are set up exactly the same. And it's easy enough to do. So they can be called from inside the blueprint. So at the minute, if anyone's explored inside it yet, your first person character that you're using to play through the task levels has some inputs already in there, and we're going to go through now and we're going to have a quick look at them. And then the last thing is they can be imported and exported. So by default, you'll probably find like a lot of the games you're working on have like a standard kind of controller setup, because you're always kind of using like the same buttons or the same inputs. So normally we use WASD, we'll normally use spacebar, we'll normally use R for reload and stuff like that. So you can, if you feel comfortable, you can experiment with this. You can import them and export them from different projects. So you might just have a project set up at home for future work, like once you get into second and third year, and that might be the project that you use just as your input manager, and you just copy and paste it into your new projects as you make them. So the way that we set it up is, I'm going to show you some screenshots and then we'll do it in an engine. So everything that we're going to look at today for this section is housed inside the project settings. Now in Unreal, there are a couple of ways into this. By default, this is normally how I'll go in. So I'll normally go to the edit menu, up in my menu bar, and then I'll go down to project settings. Once we do that, you'll get a massive list of stuff, and it is divided into sections. So as you can see here, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail when I boot up the engine. We've got like our game, then we got our engine section, and then you can see how large the scroll bar is. We can kind of go down. This is the section that we're going to be looking at today, and it's just input. As you can see here now, it's engine dash input. Input settings including default input actions and axes bindings, and that's what we want to be working on today. And you can see here was where you can do that import and export if you are comfortable and you've used it before. So if I pop open Unreal real quick, so I'm working inside of the task 3 folder today. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we get our inputs just working before we start to move on to player movement or anything like that. We're just, in this video, we're just going to get them working. So like I said earlier, if we pop into our content browser, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a quick filter down to blueprint class, and I'm going to find my first person character. So here you can see that we already have some of these inputs set up. So input access look right, this is what it's handling. Input access look down, this is what it's handling. So as we're running the game, as we input with our mouse, this is the scripting that's taking place. Same with the movement. So in the movement, we've got to move forward and move back, and that's adding our movement input to our character. So if we were to run the game, you can notice now my game's running in a different menu. It's constantly checking these as we go through. So what we want to do now is we want to add some other inputs that we need to complete like this week's task. And it's pretty simple to do. So by default, if we fly through the map, we see the first thing is we want to add a jump function. And the next thing is we want to add a sprint function past that. Okay, so we're going to add in a couple of inputs, and we're going to do a real quick debug test in this video tutorial. So we go edit, project settings, and this is what we're presented with. Okay, so mine, sorry, because I'm recording at the minute, mine is a little bit harder to see. So you can look at all settings if you want while you're in here. So if you know that you're specifically looking for something and you're not 100% sure where it is, you can kind of search for it here. But quite often you'll know the sections. So you notice like we've got like our project setting, project section, which is where we do like the description of our game. We set like the default map. So I've already set this up that by default, the map that loads up is task 1. I've already set up the game mode as well, which is kind of like the rules for it. So what we want to look at now is just the input. So click on here. So you can see already we have some axes mapping set up, and I set them up just when I made the project before I uploaded it to Blackboard. So what this means here is we click on these little arrows here to have a look. It means look right is bound to mouse X. Okay, so mouse X returns a value of 1. So axes mappings return a value of like a scalar value. So look up does the same, but that does -1. Move forward returns a +1 if I push W, but a -1 if I push S. So what that kind of means is, as we're deciding, you know, should we move the player forward, whenever we push W, it's moving it forward positively. Whenever we push S, it's moving it negatively. So we're going backwards. But what we want to do today is we want to set up an action mapping instead. So all we do here is we click plus, adds action mapping, and straight away it wants us to give it a name. Okay, so we're going to call this one jump. And now we get a list, and it's asking us, you know, what do we want to add for as a jump key. Okay, so if we click here, you notice there's a massive list. And the reason for that being is they've listed out like every kind of component that you could think of. So obviously we got gamepad, keyboard, but then we got more specific ones. Like if you were making for HTC Vive, you might want to bind something to the left trigger or the left axis. But for us, it's the same as everything in Unreal. This is context sensitive, so we can just search for whatever we're looking for, or you can browse it. So for me, I'm going to go with like a fairly standard one. I'm going to go with spacebar. So spacebar is going to be jump, so that's fine. Now, this is weird. It doesn't feel like it's done anything because there is no save button in here. But if we close now, it's definitely going to work. So now we've got this thing called jump. And we'll tell you what, we'll just call it input as well on the end. So if I close that now, and I open up my first person character, if I right click in a bit of empty space, I know that I called that binding jump input. So you see now I've got an action event that I can call, which is called jump input. And now I've got two options for it, like a press and released. So whenever it's pressed, I just want to do a print string. So print strings are just a really handy way of this, us testing stuff. And then we're just going to print on screen jump. So now if we hit play, so you see up the top left hand corner, jump appears every time I press it. So that means that our binding is working fine. So our action mapping is working perfect. Now at the minute, that's kind of, it's okay, but we might want to add like a little bit of controller support. So that's something that we want to kind of experiment with now. So all I've done is just grab my controller. So at the minute when I hit play, I have no controller inputs at all because they're not set up yet. So the next thing we want to do is go in here and we're going to set up multiple bindings for this input jump. We don't need to change anything in here. We do it all in the project settings. So edit project settings, and we'll go to input again. So now you notice the plus up here will add another action mapping, but the plus here will add an action mapping to this group, so we can give it alternative buttons. So if we press this plus, now it's asking us what we want to use. So I'm not too fussy on this one. For this, I'll probably use like A, I'm using an Xbox pad, so it would be X on a PlayStation pad. So you notice on these, it doesn't really call them X and A and stuff like that, because the same bindings will be used for an Xbox pad as a PS4 pad and Xbox One, etc., etc. So what we want to look at here is we want a face button, and we want to use bottom. Okay, so face button bottom, if anyone looks at an Xbox controller, is the A button. Face button right would be B, face button left would be X, face button top would be Y. So we're going to go with bottom. And then I hit close on that, and then we're going to hit play. Now I'm holding this close to the mic so you can hear. Now I'm pressing A on my gamepad, and it's calling the jump function, and I'm pressing spacebar and it's also calling the jump function. So that's on like really nice, so we can kind of add in like super fast. It doesn't take a lot of work. You just need to be careful that you remember what you're binding stuff to, so it's worth having like a little design document to one side so you can remember stuff. So now you notice like look right at the minute is only set to be mouse. So at the minute this project is only set to be mouse and keyboard. So we can actually change this as well. So we'll start with move forward, because it's a little bit handier. So we want to add a new binding to this. We want to make it on the gamepad, but you know, notice that we get like a lot different things that we can add here. So we've got gamepad left thumbstick, which is generally what we use, and we've got options of like X-axis or Y-axis. So Y-axis being up and down, in terms of the controller setup. So if we go with that, we'll set it with Y-axis of 1. We'll play. So now what's happening is, if you imagine the center of the controller is 0, like when your controller's sitting 100% still, it's 0. When I push up, it's returning values of anything between 0 and 1. So I hold the whole way forward, I'm doing like 1. When I hold back, I'm doing like minus 0.2, minus 0.5. So we only need to set that up once, whereas with the keys, we had to set up 2. So if we go to project settings, back into the input again, so you notice now like that's working fine. So next thing we want to do is our move right. So we'll hit plus again. We'll go to gamepad. We know it wants to be the left thumbstick, and we know it wants to be the X-axis, meaning left and right on the left thumbstick. So it's like a standard kind of controller setup that we're used to. So now when I hold right, I'm going right. When I hold left, I'm going left. And then obviously if we hold, up and right together, we'll strafe kind of to the right. So this is feeling a little bit more like traditional kind of controls that we're used to being set up. And then the next thing we'll do is we're just going to do the same for the look, because at the minute if I move that right analog stick on my controller, nothing happens. So back in the inputs, and so now we want to change this as well. So look right, we want to go with a gamepad. We know this time we want to use the right thumbstick. So if you think about looking left and right, you're always moving on the X-axis. So we'll add that in there. And then look up, we're going to add another one. Same again, gamepad, right thumbstick, Y. And that's it working fine. Okay, so this one was just a real quick little intro for us on how to set up our input manager. So just a little bit of like a recap. Remember, it's a way to set up custom bindings. It's very specific to the project, even though you can import and export, and we can call it in the blueprint, and it can be like we can move it from project to project. So that's it set up at the minute. So in the next video tutorial, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the player movement controller, and we're going to look at how we can bind that jump to actually affect the player and let the player jump and move around the level. So we'll be covering that in the next video tutorial.